In 75 years of Formula One history, only a single driver has been crowned world champion after his death. In 1970, Austrian racer Jochen Rindt was so dominant behind the wheel of an exceptional car built by Colin Chapman of Team Lotus that no driver could bridge the gap to his place at the top of the championship standings, despite there being 4 races remaining in the season after Rindt's death. Most F1 fans with any interest in the history of the sport know this, but fewer know the cloud of tragedy that followed Rindt all throughout his life, casting dark, dramatic shadows over his every move. Orphaned at just over a year old, and at odds with his team bosses when it came time to advocate for greater safety, Rindt was a prickly competitor who was nevertheless fondly remembered by so many of his rivals, and who completely changed the name of the game when it came to professionalizing motorsport. Today on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, we are going to dig into the ill-fated story of Jochen Rindt's life, the shock of his death, and the legacy he left in his wake. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. They called it Operation Gomorrah. Together, Britain's Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force pinpointed Hamburg, Germany as an ideal target for a major strategic bombing in the final week of July in 1943. It remains the heaviest assault in the history of aerial warfare. Beginning on July 24th and lasting for 8 days and 7 nights, British forces bombed the city during the day, with Americans taking over when the sun went down. That summer had been a uniquely hot and dry one in Germany, and as the bombs began to fall and buildings began to flash a light, those conditions were perfect for a firestorm. On the 27th of July, a windless day meant that bombs landed directly on target, with flames licking straight up into the sky. The heat was so intense that an area of approximately 4.5 square kilometers lit on fire, creating its own pressure system that transformed a whirling updraft of superheated air into a 1,500-foot-tall tornado of fire. At the end of the campaign, over 60% of Hamburg's houses had been destroyed. 37,000 people were killed, with an additional 180,000 injured. 2 of those presumed dead were Karl Rindt and Dr. Ilse Martinovitz. Their 15-month-old son Karl Jochen Rindt had been born on April 18, 1942 in Mainz, Germany during the thick of World War II. Jochen Rindt's mother, Austrian by birth and one of the original liberated women who would often be found ogling sports cars with a cigarette in her hand, instilled her love of sport in her infant son thanks to an early career as a tennis player before she followed her own father into law. She'd considered rally racing in her youth, though she'd been discouraged by her family. Rindt's father, meanwhile, from Germany, owned a spice mill. Like his future wife Ilse, he had dreamed of forging a racing career of his own until familial obligations confined him to safer and more culturally accepted routes. Still, the two had maintained a level of thrilling opposition to the social norms of the time. Ilse had been previously married to a man named Otto Eiselben, and together they had a young son, Uwe, in 1939. But when she met Karl, a pilot who had flown his own private plane to Graz, she divorced her husband and wed Karl instead. In 1942, Ilse and Karl had a child together, their son named Jochen, and the family had evacuated to Bad Ischl near Salzburg. Unfortunately, Karl and Ilse Rindt had been called to Hamburg to attend to business at a local office of the family spice mill. They arrived just in time for the bombing raids. When the two failed to retrieve their son, they were presumed dead, and young Jochen was sent to Graz to live with his maternal grandparents. Despite having been born in Germany, Rindt would consider himself Austrian at heart, and it was under Austria's flag that he registered his racing license when his career first kicked off. He had no love lost for the Germans, for whom he blamed for the death of his parents. Even as a young child, it was clear that Jochen Rindt was going to be a handful. He was headstrong from the get-go, just like his mother, and that rebellious streak was regularly indulged by his grandparents. He had very little interest in being desk-bound at school, but turn him loose on the ski slopes or enter him in a sport, and he positively thrived. When he hit his teenage years, that competitive spirit flourished, and he found himself kicked out of a series of schools in both Austria and England for poor grades and even worse behavior. Upon losing his seat at a school in England and returning to Graz, Rindt met a fellow teenager who would help shape the course of his future life. That teenager was named Helmut Marko. Marko was the son of an electrical dealer who had a need for speed that could only be rivaled by Rindt himself. Their teen years were consumed by trying to acquire ever quicker motorized vehicles, starting with scooters, and taking them to set ever faster laps around the local roads. Before long, the two were expelled from one school and sent off to the mountains to attend a boarding school designed to rid them of their unruly attitudes. Instead, it gave Jochen Rindt his first taste of four wheels. The boarding house where the boys lived was a half-hour walk from the school grounds themselves. So when Rindt broke his leg skiing, he requested his grandparents organize a car for him, and he would do the work of finding a schoolmate to serve as his chauffeur. It did not take long before Rindt dismissed that chauffeur and began driving himself everywhere with a broken leg, unbeknownst to his grandparents. We had a car, no license, and we managed to go nearly every weekend to Graz where we had our parties, and there was a good system, Helmut Marko recalled in The Uncrowned King by David Tremayne. Most of the time we managed someone in the car who had a license, and the system was like this. Everybody gets a drive, but only as long as he doesn't make a mistake. A mistake means that he was not on the limit, so he was judged by all the others. And let's say some wild driving started. Rindt was described by his friends at the time as being laddish, a James Dean-type figure who was always the ringleader of any chaos going on in town. He had an adventurous, rebellious spirit, and on four wheels, he had found freedom. The moment Jochen Rindt had a license, he sourced a second-hand Simca that he began entering in local racing events alongside Helmut Marko. In 1961, both of them made a trip to the Nürburgring to spectate the German Grand Prix, and Rindt declared confidently that racing Formula One cars was exactly what he would go on to do with his life. After the death of his grandfather, Jochen Rindt was able to convince his grandmother to buy him a brand new Alfa Romeo Giulietta TI that he had tuned by the best in the business before taking it out to local hill climbs, first in Austria, then in Germany, before spreading to Italy. In August of 1963, when he turned 21, Rindt came into his full inheritance from his parents, $80,000 at that time, which would be the equivalent of more than $800,000 when adjusted for inflation today. He poured all of that money directly into his racing career, buying a Formula Junior Cooper T59 single-seater car and entering the Italian Formula Junior Championship. Within his first few races, he was winning. From Formula Junior, it was off to Formula 2, but in September of 1963, he made his Formula 1 debut. That month, a non-championship F1 race had been scheduled at the Zeltweg airfield. Despite the fact that he'd only competed in a handful of open-wheel races by this point, Rindt was determined to compete in this race that would take place for the first time in his home country, so he borrowed a Cooper T67 from a friend named Kurt Barty Berry to stack up against the likes of Jim Clark, Jack Brabham, and Joe Bonnier. His Ford engine ultimately failed well before the checkered flag, but he came to a realization. It was in 1963 that I recognized motor racing suited me better than anything else, Rindt told Austrian journalist Heinz Prühler. This discovery pleased me because otherwise I would have wasted 2 years. Even then, Rindt had gained notoriety as a somewhat reckless on-the-edge racer, albeit one whose audacity behind the wheel promised great things. In one of his debut events at the Flugplatzrennen in 1961, for example, he'd been black flagged for his dangerous driving style. Completely unaware of what that flag meant, Rindt stayed on the track and kept driving like a madman. There was also a time in a Formula Junior race that an accident resulted in the ambulance racing onto the track. While the rest of the competition slowed down for the ambulance, which had parked on the track, Rindt kept his foot to the floor and rocketed between the ambulance and a hay bale to take the lead of the race. After seeing that, a friend told journalist Helmut Zwickel If Jochen Rindt survives, he will be world champion in 2 years. While it would take longer than 2 years for that championship to come to fruition, it was an incredibly prescient prediction because after exactly 1 year of junior open wheel racing, Rindt and friend Barty Berry decided it was time to move to Formula 2. With the help of his close friend Kurt Barty Berry, Jochen Rindt secured use of a Brabham Formula 2 machine to take his professional racing career to the next level. But sadly, that partnership came to an unexpected and early end in February of 1964. Barty Berry was killed in a road accident on his way home from the opera, and as such, Rindt's debut in this new category of open-wheel racing came during a race renamed the Barty Berry Memorial. There, Rindt competed alongside talented drivers like Chris Amon, Mike Haywood, and Peter Revson, albeit with unspectacular results. However, soon after that was a Formula 2 race at the Nürburgring that saw Rindt finish fourth, followed by an absolutely shocking victory at Crystal Palace in England. That win came at the London Trophy event, where Rindt was able to triumph over the likes of Graham Hill, and suddenly, the Austrian's name was on the lips of the continental racing press. Just a few months later, in 1964, Rindt was invited to compete in his first 24 hours of Le Mans with Luigi Kennedy's North American racing team, and he made his Formula One World Championship debut behind the wheel of a Brabham BT11 BRM, fielded by Rob Walker at the unloved Zeltweg circuit for the inaugural and official Austrian Grand Prix after the previous year's non-championship test run. Even though Rindt only managed to qualify 13th, and even though he retired from the race, Rob Walker was impressed. The Austrian driver was just 22 years old and already carried himself with an unrefined speed and warmth that promised a great future. For Walker, it was clear that Rindt was going to be a full-time member of the Formula One grid for the 1965 season, but differing sponsorship obligations prevented Walker from actually being able to offer the Austrian a ride. Instead, it was John Cooper who came calling. Cooper cars had been a shining light of the international Grand Prix scene, but by the time Rindt signed on, it was a team on its way down. John Cooper's father died, taking with him the business sense that had made the team financially viable, and leaving the team's personnel in disarray as it prepared for 65. The team that had once had a reputation for pushing the boundaries of design innovation was instead left to tweak its 1964 cars, hoping that its driver pairing of Rindt and Bruce McLaren could bring those cars to success. That turned out to be too large of an ask. Rindt finished 5 of the season's 10 races, and his 4th place finish in Germany and his 6th in America netted him a grand total of just 4 points, which was good enough for 13th in the World Drivers' Championship standings. Instead, the Austrians' shining point of the season came with Nart at Le Mans, where Rindt and American teammate Maston Gregory powered their Ferrari 250 LM to a stunning victory. But there was still hope on the horizon. Heading into 1966, Formula One had introduced a brand new engine formula, and this allowed Cooper to mate its decade-old Maserati V12 engines to a brand new T81 chassis. This wasn't really the most groundbreaking evolution in car design, but Cooper knew the engine inside and out, and it knew that machinery was reliable. The rest of the field struggled to develop a reliable power plant, so Rindt and his new teammate John Surtees were able to dice with the best of them. Rindt snagged 2 second-place finishes and 1 third place, in addition to 3 other points-paying results that year. And at the end of the season, he took home 3rd in the World Drivers' Championship standings. That high proved to be short-lived. Throughout 1967, as Cooper once again faltered, tensions between the driver and the team grew. Manager Roy Salvadori snapped at Rindt, accusing him of driving recklessly and with no mechanical sympathy. And by the end of the season, Rindt was intentionally over-revving his engine to force failures so he no longer had to drive for the team. That specific incident took place at Watkins Glen, and Salvadori and Rindt ultimately decided it was best to part ways before the finale that year at the Mexican Grand Prix. Rindt's biggest win that season? He married a young Finnish model named Nina Lincoln. Nina's father was a racer, and it was at the racetrack where she and her future husband first became aware of each other, though their relationship took a little while to kick off. Nina was traveling, modeling, and studying, and occasionally she turned up at smaller racing events to support her father Kurt. The two really got to know each other at a ski resort in 1963, and 4 years later, they'd become so inseparable that they were wed in March of 1967. Despite the fact that his relationship with Cooper ended on bad terms, Jochen Rindt was a wanted man. He had continued to compete in Formula 2 in addition to his Formula 1 races, and his success in F2 is undeniable. He had even gone overseas to Indianapolis to try his hand at the annual 500, so when his services were made available heading into '68, Rindt received offers from all but 2 Formula 1 teams. But he knew exactly where he wanted to go. Brabham. Brabham had won the World Championship in both 1966 and 1967, and Rindt had a ton of respect for team founder Jack Brabham. But beyond that mutual appreciation, the Brabham's Repco V8 engines turned out to be disastrous, and Rindt had very little to offer in the world of technical expertise. Jack Brabham remembered, with Jochen, you put the car down and he just drove it. He didn't know anything about the development, and he didn't want to know either. He just had confidence in us and the way the car was designed and set up. Even though the team founder would go on to point out that Rindt was a fantastic driver despite the lack of functional engineering knowledge, it's also entirely reasonable to assume that the team could have benefited from a little extra input on the engineering front in 1968. Rindt's best finish of the season was that year's opening event at the South African Grand Prix, because that race took place so early in the season that the new Brabhams weren't ready yet to be drafted into action. Once the new car was in place, Rindt secured exactly 1 more podium and promptly retired from every single other Grand Prix in 1968. The relationship between driver and team at this point was fantastic, and Jack Brabham had nothing but compliments to offer his Austrian racer. But already, at this point, Rindt was thinking bigger. He'd become close friends with none other than Bernie Ecclestone. We know Bernie Ecclestone would go on to become one of the most influential people in the history of Formula 1, transforming the sport's broadcast rights into a multi-million-dollar empire. But in the late 1960s, Ecclestone was mostly just a former driver who had realized he'd be better suited to leveraging his business acumen in the driver management department. After the death of his original protege Stuart Lewis Evans, Ecclestone instead turned his attention to one of motorsport's rising stars, Jochen Rindt. But I think it's a little reductive to just call Ecclestone Jochen Rindt's manager and nothing else, because the two were close friends who were equally shrewd when it came to milking the most money out of a situation. That might sound somewhat crass, but motorsport didn't pay well back in the 60s. Drivers earned a smattering of prize and entry fees for competing in Grand Prix, but it was nowhere near enough to make a living. So that's why you had drivers like Jochen Rindt still actively competing in almost every Formula 2 race, as well as jumping overseas to race in the Indy 500. It's also why sponsorships began to emerge, with drivers aligning themselves with certain tire manufacturers or oil providers in exchange for free products or financial stipends. While some drivers did definitely enjoy staying active in multiple disciplines, Rindt was not one of them. He enjoyed Formula 1, but he despised races like the Indy 500 because of its danger. He competed for the money, and that was often it. And while he enjoyed the atmosphere of the Brabham team, he also had grander plans. He wanted to win a world championship, and he wanted to make money doing it. As Bernie Ecclestone recalled, at the end of '68, we had a choice for Jochen of the Goodyear deal with Brabham or the Firestone deal with Lotus. I said to him, if you want to win the world championship, you've got more chance with Lotus than Brabham. If you want to stay alive, you've got more chance with Brabham than Lotus. It wasn't a bad thing to say, it was a matter of fact. Rindt made the ultimate call. He wanted that championship, and he opted for Lotus. Ecclestone stepped up to help negotiate a handsome deal. But that question of survival at Lotus would become a major concern. For all of its success, Team Lotus came with a reputation. It was quick and audacious, but its pushing of boundaries often came at the expense of safety. The story of Team Lotus starts with founder Colin Chapman's desire to build ever quicker cars, which he summed up in a very simple statement. Adding power makes you faster on the straights. Subtracting weight makes you faster everywhere. That sounds like common sense to us today, but at that time, overall speed was thought to be more closely associated with power, and to support that power, a lot of car makers felt it was necessary to build robust machines. That basically meant that a car with a more powerful engine needed to be strong enough to cope with the added weight and stress associated with that engine. And that often meant those cars were heavier, more rigid, and bigger all around. Chapman turned that logic on its head. A student of structural engineering at the University College London and a pilot at the University of London Air Squadron, Chapman saw how the advancements in flight could be associated with lighter and more agile planes, not exclusively through more powerful engines. And after he founded Team Lotus and began building Formula One cars, he continued to refine that mindset in the automotive space. In 1962, for example, Chapman introduced the Lotus 25, which was revolutionary in that it featured the first fully stressed monocoque chassis in Formula One history. By taking those various panels that composed a chassis and combining them into one unit, the Lotus 25 was therefore lighter and more rigid than the cars around it. Later on in the future would come the Lotus 49, which introduced the car's engine as a stressed part of the chassis. Both of those innovations set the standard for open-wheel car construction for, quite literally, the rest of history. But those were Chapman's successes. There were plenty of experiments that failed to pan out, resulting in retirements, crashes, and just general failures. And there were several drivers who were either killed or seriously injured behind the wheel of a Lotus. That includes Sterling Moss, Alan Stacey, Mike Taylor, Mike Spence, Bobby Marshman, and several others. Even the seemingly invincible Jim Clark lost his life driving a Lotus machine in Formula 2 the year before Jochen Rindt joined the team. Rindt himself had a very strange relationship with founder Colin Chapman. As a driver, he understood the risks associated with Lotus, a team that was known for developing unreliable cars that in a 21-month period between 1967 and 1969 crashed a whopping 31 times. As fellow Lotus driver Graham Hill liked to quip, "Every time I'm being overtaken by my own wheel, I know I'm in a Lotus." But it was at Lotus that Rindt felt he would have his best shot of glory. From the very beginning, the Austrian driver was quoted as saying, "At Lotus, I can either be world champion or die." His art and the education of Team Lotus kicked off early, as Rindt and teammate Graham Hill were sent off to New Zealand and Australia to compete in the Tasman Series during the winter. It was there that Rindt had his first major accident behind the wheel of a Chapman-produced car. During the Rothmans International Race at Leven, Rindt flew off the track and plowed into an earth embankment. His Lotus flipped, and he was briefly trapped under it until a few local racers rushed to the scene. One pushed the Lotus up just long enough for a fellow driver to yank Rindt free. He was unhurt, which was great, but it was a very early lesson in the goings-on of this new team. And he would get more lessons very soon after. The Formula One season officially got underway in March at Kyalami, where Rindt was quick, but was forced to watch his old Brabham team snatch a victory from the sidelines because his Lotus 49B had retired. He found somewhat more success in some non-championship events, but things were about to take a shocking turn. Heading into the 1969 Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic Park, Colin Chapman had a bold idea. He was one of several team bosses who had fitted his race cars with wings that were mounted on the suspension. They were awkward things, with the rear wing in particular mounted on struts that were several feet above the chassis, and Rindt was no fan. Speaking to journalist Mike Dudson at Motoring News, Rindt was firmly anti-wing, saying, "Wings are very dangerous because sooner or later, if wings get any bigger and the car happens to get into a spin, the airflow is reversed and the rear of the car will lift off." It's worth noting that kind of liftoff, we know now, wouldn't be possible. Rindt was adamant that wings should be banned. One of the reasons that a bad car can handle well these days is because of wings, Rindt argued. If you have a bad car, the design is really rather unimportant when you have the advantage of a big wing. In other words, wing development threatens to become much more important than chassis development as we have come to know it. This article was published just before the build-up to the Spanish Grand Prix, and Colin Chapman was furious, to the extent that he effectively gave teammate Graham Hill a list of talking points about wings to share in his interviews. As a member of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, Rindt was one of the men tasked with investigating Montjuic Park's circuit safety standards and found that organizers had failed to erect the proper guardrails. The ones that existed were just simply too low. Race organizers were forced to make the changes, and come race day, Rindt bolted into the lead at the drop of the flag, hoping to secure his very first Grand Prix victory. But it didn't take long until Graham Hill felt something break on his Lotus, which sent him flying into the guardrails at a corner just past the pits. Lotus mechanics raced to the scene to find Hill, thankfully unhurt, but a quick look at the wreckage caused them to wonder if that rear wing mounted on those struts hadn't failed. One mechanic rushed to the pits as quick as he could to tell Colin Chapman to bring Rindt in, but it was too late. Heading into the 20th lap of the race with a stunning 8-second lead, Rindt's rear wing also snapped and sent his Lotus careening directly into the wreckage of his teammate's car. Again, miraculously, the driver escaped with nothing but a broken nose and probably a concussion, and that's because the taller trackside barriers had prevented both Lotuses from escaping further into the crowd. One marshal lost an eye, while Rindt spent 4 days in the hospital and pointed out that he felt extremely dizzy for a week after the wreck. He skipped the Monaco Grand Prix that year, though he did head over to America to compete in the Indianapolis 500. But after that Montjuic Park accident, Rindt was irate. His worst fears about Colin Chapman had been proven correct, and he didn't hesitate to point the finger directly at the Lotus boss. "I place the blame on Chapman, and rightfully so, because he should have calculated that the wing would break," Rindt raved to a reporter just after the crash. Several days later, speaking on Austrian television, he added, "These wings are insanity in my eyes and should not be allowed on racing cars. But to get any wisdom into Colin Chapman's head is impossible." Asked if he trusted Lotus after the accident, Rindt responded, "I never had any trust in Lotus." On May 9th, 1969, Jochen Rindt penned a letter to boss Colin Chapman at the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge in Indianapolis. I'm going to read this full letter to you because I think it's critical, and it's a huge turning point in the sport. It reads, "Dear Colin, I just got back to Geneva and I'm going to have a second opinion on the state of my head tomorrow. Personally, I feel very weak and ill. I still have to lay down most of the day. After seeing the new doctor and hearing his opinion, we can make a final decision on Monaco and Indy. I got hold of this incredible picture which pretty much explains the accident. I didn't know it would fly that high. Robin Hurd apparently saw the wing go, but could not see the accident since it happened around the corner. Now to the whole situation, Colin. I have been racing in F1 for 5 years, and I have made one mistake. I rammed Chris Amon in Clermont-Ferrand, and I had one accident in Zandvoort due to gear selection failure. Otherwise, I managed to stay out of trouble. This situation changed rapidly since I joined your team. Levin, Eiffel Race F2 Wishbones, and now Barcelona. Honestly, your cars are so quick that we could still be competitive with a few extra pounds used to make some of the weakest parts stronger. On top of that, I think you ought to spend time checking what your different employees are doing. I'm sure the wishbones on the F2 car would have looked different. Please give my suggestions some thought. I can only drive a car in which I have some confidence, and I feel the point of no confidence is quite near. Best regards. Colin Chapman couldn't believe it. Never before had one of his drivers so publicly spoken out against him. Dick Scammell, racing manager at Team Lotus, recalled, "I think Chapman was quite used to people doing what he asked them to do, or he just got rid of them. Whereas Jochen was good enough that he couldn't get rid of him, so he had to bend over a bit for him and allow him to do things." The two men were furious and refused to speak directly to one another. If Rindt needed to get a message to Chapman, he would ask Bernie Ecclestone to send it over. And if Chapman wanted to talk to Rindt, he would ask journalist Jabby Cronbach to pass on the information. Can you imagine this today in Formula One? Making matters even worse was the fact that the stilt-mounted wings were banned before the Monaco Grand Prix, though ultimately Graham Hill would go on to take victory. By the end of the season, aerodynamic devices were allowed so long as they were fixed to the bodywork, not the suspension, and so long as they were unable to move. But things didn't get easier. During practice for the Dutch Grand Prix, Lotus debuted its latest car, the 63, which was an experimental four-wheel drive race car that Graham Hill labeled a death trap and that Rindt adamantly refused to drive. Once again, Chapman was irate. He felt that the 63 represented a major leap forward in motorsport design, and once again it was his new driver who was raising a stink. Rindt retired from the Dutch and French Grand Prix, then took a fourth-place finish at Silverstone. Another retirement at the German Grand Prix followed, but things there started to turn around in the Lotus organization. After weeks of using intermediaries to speak to one another, Rindt and Chapman hashed out their problems in a marathon meeting that weekend, ultimately emerging with a tenuous truce that meant they could once again speak directly to one another. Rindt still wasn't completely pleased. He was toying with the idea of returning to Brabham because he felt like his bad luck at Lotus could mark an early end to his racing career. He and Bernie Ecclestone were also making grand plans to start their very own Formula One team, which would get its start as Jochen Rindt Racing in Formula 2. But those concerns were pushed to the side as luck began to favor Rindt once again. At the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, Rindt flashed across the finish line in second, just 0.08 of a second behind winner Jackie Stewart, who was crowned world champion. The F1 circus then moved off to Canada, where Rindt took a podium, albeit a third place and not a second. But then, at the US Grand Prix, he was unstoppable. He set the weekend's fastest lap to secure pole position, and even though he did lose the lead to Jackie Stewart at one point in the race, Rindt was able to reassume that lead when Jackie Stewart retired. In the closing stages, Rindt's engine sounded sicker and sicker, but he held out and crossed the line a winner, his first ever victory in the Formula One Championship. That the Mexican Grand Prix ended in a retirement hardly mattered by this point. Rindt had secured 22 points to finish fourth in the World Drivers' Championship standings, and the future seemed bright. After fielding offers from other teams, and after even inking a contract with Brabham, Rindt ultimately made the decision that his best shot at winning a championship would lie with Lotus. He inked a one-year extension with Chapman, and at the end of the year, during a dinner with a journalist, Rindt reflected, "In 1970, I want to be world champion, the biggest name in motor racing. But racing will only be part of my life. When I have the title, I'm going to retire immediately. I just don't want to be finished and exhausted before I'm 30 and just carry on racing because there's nothing else I want, can do, or am interested in. There are so many things which I would like to do. Time is the most valuable thing you can have. And listen, I'll be living another, say, 50 years. But I have taken out from 28 years more than you can usually gain. Isn't that simple to understand?" Rindt went on to argue that there were only two true professional drivers competing in Formula One, himself and Tyrrell driver Jackie Stewart, because both of them, quote, drive with our heads. Such was the tone set heading into the 1970 Formula One season, which admittedly started off on the wrong foot. Lotus's latest challenger, the 72, wasn't ready to compete by the start of the year, which meant Rindt was once again piloting the aging Lotus 49. But when the 72 made its debut in Spain, it just didn't work. Chief mechanic and team manager Dick Scammell explained that the 72 was, quote, a horrendous car to begin with that anti-squat and anti-dive on it. No feel at all. The drivers needed that feel for the car to move a bit. To make it even worse, a front brake failure saw Rindt narrowly avoid colliding with the barriers. His fear was clear, even as he returned to the pits and shouted at Chapman, "I'll never sit in that fucking car again as long as I live." Rindt did indeed get back in that car and competed in the race, which ended in a retirement, but he refused to consider driving it again until its major issues were worked out. That meant that for both the Monaco and Belgian Grand Prix, the Austrian was back behind the wheel of his 49C. In Monaco, it turned out to be a fruitful choice. Rindt had a poor start, but when the competition began retiring, and as he began to find the pace to pass the rest, Rindt took victory. The Belgian Grand Prix ended in retirement, but that was no matter, because the revamped Lotus 72, now known as the 72C, was ready to make its debut. This machine featured a stiffer monocoque chassis and had completely eliminated the anti-dive and anti-squat components of the suspension that had made it such a pain for drivers to race in. It was a sensitive, responsive car, and in his first flying laps around the Zandvoort circuit for the Dutch Grand Prix, Rindt crushed the previous lap record by a whopping 7 seconds. Come race day, Rindt would begin a glorious winning streak that would launch him from 4th in the championship standings to a dominant 1st. He won at Zandvoort, then in France, then in England, and then in Germany. Come the conclusion of August's event at the Nürburgring, Rindt had 45 points, and the next closest competitor, Jack Brabham, was 20 points behind. During his home race, the Austrian Grand Prix, Rindt suffered a retirement, but in some ways, that was no matter. With just 4 Grand Prix remaining in 1970 and a dominant car beneath him, Rindt felt confident he had all the tools he would need to cruise to his first title. But first, he would need to conquer the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. As Jochen Rindt came ever closer to securing his first world championship, the question of retirement loomed over him, encouraged in many ways by his wife Nina. 1970 had been the kind of year that would shatter the determination of even the bravest drivers. At the start of June, Bruce McLaren was killed testing a Can-Am race car at Goodwood. Much like Jim Clark, McLaren was one of those drivers whose death felt impossible. The Kiwi had been talking about retirement and was thinking about transitioning into running his race team rather than competing for it. Then in a flash, he was dead. 3 weeks later, driver Piers Courage was killed. Courage and Rindt had become close. Their wives, Sally and Nina, were practically inseparable, and the couples could regularly be found in one another's company, often with the inclusion of Jackie and Helen Stewart. But on June 21st, at the Dutch Grand Prix, Piers Courage made contact with Lotus driver John Miles, and Courage's car burst into flames. The wreck had happened on lap 23 of 90, and in those days, races were not flagged for accidents or for death. Instead, the Grand Prix continued, with Jochen Rindt taking a decisive victory upon the debut of the innovative Lotus 72. "I saw the burning and I saw Piers's helmet very near to it," Rindt reflected after the event. "For some laps, I desperately hoped that he had climbed out and thrown away his helmet, but then I realized that Piers, if he had come out, would never have put his helmet down so near to the car." His friend was dead. Rindt crossed the finish line with a monstrous 30-second lead. There, he received the official news that Courage had been killed in the accident and that his wife Nina had immediately rushed to Sally Courage's side. The two women left the track together. "It was odd," Nina Rindt recalled, "but I was angry that Jochen won. It was sort of, how could he win the race in which Pierce was killed? It was all just so horrific, so disgusting. I was very angry, though not really at Jochen. I was just angry at the whole thing." That bevy of emotion was present on the race winner's face as he stood on the podium wrapped in the victor's laurels. In an interview immediately following, he said, "That somebody is lost in this sport is nothing new, but it is bitter indeed when it happens to be your friend." When Rindt began the journey home alongside Bernie Ecclestone, the question of retirement weighed heavily in his mind. The sudden death of one of his closest friends sent him reeling, but for the first time in his career, he had a car that wasn't just capable of winning races, but of dominating them. He was 1 point behind Jackie Stewart in the championship standings, and if the Lotus 72 continued to perform, he could almost guarantee a title at the close of the season. But as he ultimately told both Ecclestone and Nina, "If I want to keep my self-respect, I can't quit during the season." It wasn't an easy decision to make. In The Uncrowned King, Nina Rindt reflected on the impact of Pierce Courage's death and why it felt so different from the deaths of other drivers, and I want to read that quote here to you in full. "I guess the thing was that Pierce dying showed that it could happen. When Jimmy Clark died, Jochen was shattered, but I sort of pushed it away. I told myself it was a fluke. It couldn't happen to Jochen. I was brought up with racing because of my father, and I never regarded it as dangerous. When you're a young person, you just push that danger away, don't you? Or you couldn't survive. When it was Pierce, when I saw Sally and the kids, I realized that it was really serious. We took her home in Bernie's plane, and then Jochen and I stayed with Bernie at his place. I completely collapsed when we got there. Jochen was angry with me. 'You have to come down for dinner.' But I just lay there. How could anyone care about dinner?" Courage's death wasn't the only one on Rindt's mind. The couple had become close skiing friends with a man named Ernst Morsbrucker, the nephew of the owner of the hotel where they stayed over 1969's holiday season. As they departed, Morsbrucker was diagnosed with cancer, and weeks later, he was dead. Nina revealed that Rindt was consumed with worry, asking himself, is it better to die the way Ernst did, or to die instantly, like Pierce? He thought perhaps it was better to go like Pierce. The day of Courage's funeral, the racing contingent quickly traded their morning gear for racing overalls and jetted off to Rouen for a Formula 2 race. There, in the Formula 3 support event, 2 young drivers were killed in separate incidents. The racing world was seemingly plagued by death, and Nina Rindt was firmly convinced that her husband could seriously consider stepping away before it was too late. The primary problem was that Jochen Rindt firmly believed he was only just beginning to crack the code as a modern racing driver, one who was not only successful on the track, but who fostered a variety of commercial interests outside of the cockpit. He and Bernie Ecclestone had established Jochen Rindt Racing, a successful Formula 2 team that looked poised to break into Formula 1 in the near future. Rindt had put up his own money to establish the Jochen Rindt Motor Show, almost single-handedly developing a healthy appreciation of motorsport in his home country. He was also keenly aware of the fact that Formula 1 was becoming ever more lucrative, and as world champion, he'd command greater entry fees from race organizers. And as he arrived in Monza for what could be the championship decider, he was weighing up several options for the future. Yes, Rindt was thinking about retiring immediately. He'd seen the way the death of Pierce Courage racked the man's family as well as the racing world as a whole, and he knew that his Lotus put him in greater danger than some of the slower but more robustly built machines on the grid. He also considered competing for one more year in F1, to effectively take a victory lap, sweeping up money from entry fees and promotional stints, and if that worked well, maybe he'd hold out for a second year. He could see the tides turning, could see the money to be made. He was hesitant to step away just as the sport was becoming professionalized. And other opportunities were arising as well. Despite the fact that he had not enjoyed his first attempt at NASCAR in Rockingham, a weekend spent with Bill France, the series founder, had convinced him that there was way more money to make in American stock car racing than in Grand Prix racing, and the enclosed nature of the cars theoretically made them safer. Everyone who knew Rindt at the time had a very different idea of what he would have done when he won the title, and that was largely because he was changing his mind on an almost hourly basis. This was the background noise accompanying Jochen Rindt's fated trip to Monza for the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. That weekend, Lotus brought with it a brand new chassis, the Lotus 72.5. This was the machine that Rindt was expected to use in the Grand Prix itself, but in practice, a young rising star named Emerson Fittipaldi was supposed to complete the shakedown process to guarantee it was fit to race. Instead, Fittipaldi wrecked the new chassis. He collided with Ignazio Giunti's Ferrari at the Parabolica after locking up. Fittipaldi rolled his Lotus over top of the Ferrari and ended up colliding with a tree outside of the racetrack. He was unharmed, but the Lotus 72.5 was damaged. That left Jochen Rindt with the older but still successful chassis, the 72.2, to utilize in practice in the race. The Austrian driver had requested his team remove the wings, believing that the wing-free car would be quicker at Monza, even if it'd be more difficult to handle. He reported an additional 800 RPM without the drag of the rear wing, and that was enough for Colin Chapman to okay the decision, even though one of Lotus's other drivers, John Miles, reported that a single lap in the wingless Lotus was, quote, enough to convince me that the car was undrivable. The first day of practice, September 4th, went off without a hitch, aside from Fittipaldi's crash. Leaving the track, Nina Rindt remembers that, unprompted, her husband turned to her and said, "I feel wonderful." September 5th brought with it final practice, and the quickest times of the day would set the grid. Colin Chapman had ordered Rindt's Lotus to undergo an engine change overnight, with a newly fitted engine capable of a 205 mph top gear designed to set the pole position. Thanks to the slipstreaming nature of the event, though, Rindt wasn't super concerned about securing pole as he might have been at other tracks. He climbed into the cockpit of his Lotus 72 that afternoon and told journalist Heinz Prühler, "I must go." Rindt turned one lap at Monza, then 2, 3, and 4. Team Lotus awaited the glimmer of his red and gold machine flitting by for its 5th circuit, but the car never returned to the pits. Instead, soon after, Denny Hulme cruised slowly into Lotus's pit stall to report that there'd been an accident. Jackie Stewart recalled that slowly the track grew silent as more and more drivers returned to the pits. He heard directly from Hulme that there had been an accident, and he went directly to race control to inquire after the well-being of his friend. But there were no straight answers. No one would definitively state anything other than the fact that Rindt was out of his car. Hulme had been hot on Rindt's heels at the time of the accident. Asked about it after the fact, he explained, "Jochen was following me for several laps and slowly catching me up, and I didn't go through the second Lesmo corner very quick. So I pulled to the one side and let Jochen pass me, and then I followed him down into the Parabolica. We were going very fast, and he waited until about the 200 meters to put down the brakes. The car just sort of went to the right, and then it turned to the left, and turned out to the right again, and then suddenly just very quickly left into the guardrail." Trackside personnel brought Rindt back to the paddock in the bed of a pickup truck. Stewart was one of the first drivers to lay eyes on him, remembering, "Jochen was just lying there on his own. I'll never forget that. There was nobody else there. I could immediately see that his ankles were very badly damaged, but there was no bleeding. If there's no bleeding, it means the heart is not pumping. A priest came to give him the last rites while I was still there. I walked away knowing for myself that Jochen was not coming back. Nina, Helen, Bernie, and Colin went to the hospital, each at that point believing that he was still alive. In Italy, they never pronounced a driver dead at the scene of the accident, otherwise they would have to call off the event. Always they would say they died on the way to the hospital, but I had seen Jochen's feet. I knew. Nina Rindt recalled that in the silence of the paddock, Colin Chapman informed her that Jochen had spun. Believing it to be a routine racing incident, she set her stopwatch to the side to take a break from scoring her husband's laps. Then someone ran up to tell her that they would escort her to the medical center. Confused, Nina went. When she arrived, Jackie Stewart tried to tell her that her husband was okay, but she recalled seeing how pale he was, trembling as he delivered the news. No one would allow her to enter the ambulance as it took Jochen away. Then she spied a priest leaving the medical center, who told her to have courage. Looking around, Nina Rindt realized that everyone was staring at her, and she recognized those expressions. She recalled, "I knew that something very bad had indeed happened. I could see that from the faces all around me." She allowed herself to be driven to the hospital, where she received the news straight from Bernie Ecclestone because doctors were hesitant to tell her. Jochen is dead. Once it was clear that Rindt's crash had been fatal, the members of Team Lotus set to work. In Italy, law dictated that for every death, there must be someone responsible, and in motorsport, that often meant the team boss, designers, and mechanics could be arrested, with the team equipment and cars impounded by the police. Lotus had experienced this already back in 1961. Jim Clark was involved in the incident that killed Ferrari driver and championship contender Wolfgang von Trips at Monza, and they had had their garage taken over by Italian police. So this time, the crew leaped into action. Colin Chapman and Nina Rindt were ushered to private planes that flew them out of Italy, while back at the track, Lotus mechanics made quick work of tearing down their garage area, packing up the remaining cars, and fleeing to the Swiss border. Allegedly, one member of the team dressed in a disguise in order to retrieve the engine and gearbox from a locked room at the track, though no one quite knows if that's actually true. In the aftermath, Nina Rindt recalled, "It sounds really weird, but I was less shocked by Jochen's death than I was by Pierce's. They were so close. I wasn't surprised anymore. I had lived through so much by then. The first time it was really, my God, it can actually happen. You're so young, so stupid. You have this defense and you don't think about it. And I don't think Sally did either. I was in shock, but maybe not as much as I would have been if Pierce had not died." But for the rest of the Formula One field, things had to return to normal. As soon as the ambulance left the grounds, Jackie Stewart climbed back into his Tyrrell to qualify for the Italian Grand Prix. He turned 2 quick laps, able to compartmentalize the loss of his friend. But when he was handed a glass bottle of Coca-Cola after climbing out of the car, he smashed it against the wall. "I was so angry at the stupidity of his death that his life had been taken just like that," Stewart remembered. "I felt completely empty, drained, and exhausted. I felt capable of nothing and absolutely lost." But the race went on. Ferrari's Clay Riccatelli qualified on pole, and he went on to secure his maiden Grand Prix victory in front of a crowd of overjoyed Italian fans. They had already put the tragedy of Jochen Rindt's death behind them. Shortly afterward, on September 11th, the racing contingent somberly made their way to Rindt's funeral in Graz, and Swedish racer Joe Bonnier was tasked with delivering a eulogy he likely never expected to write. "To die doing something that you love to do is to die happy," he said. "And Jochen has the admiration and the respect of all of us. The only way you can admire and respect a great driver and a friend. Regardless in what happens in the remaining Grand Prix this year, to all of us, Jochen is the real world champion." Despite the fact that a major investigation into the crash was carried out by a group of PR men titled Grand Prix Accident Survey, there's never been a consensus about what exactly caused Jochen Rindt to spin. Some people suggested that the right front brake shaft had sheared under heavy braking, while others believed that the removal of the wings caused the car to become violently unstable at high speeds. The 1972 Grand Prix Accident Survey describes the crash in major detail, explaining exactly what happened to Rindt once his Lotus was out of control. But there was no way to inspect the damage and pinpoint what caused the accident and what was just damage sustained in the wreck itself. Colin Chapman, too, picked up his pen to craft a lengthy defense of Lotus's manufacturing techniques, using evidence to refute claims that the suspension had snapped, that mechanical failure had taken place, or that the construction of things like the brakes were shoddy. He described how Lotus had investigated all of the questionable parts and found nothing terribly wrong, nothing to indicate a failure. The cause of Jochen Rindt's death, though, is clear. His lap belt caused major injuries to his chest, neck, and spine. The front of his Lotus was ripped away as he was spinning, and the centrifugal force caused by the spinning car sucked Rindt out of the hole in the cockpit. At this time, seatbelt use was not mandatory in Formula One, and while Rindt had secured his lap belt, he had never used his crotch strap. Had he done so, it is widely believed that Rindt would have remained in the cockpit of his Lotus. He would not have slid out of the hole in the front of his car. He would very likely have suffered injuries, but he would not have been strangled to death by his own lap belt. Jochen Rindt would have lived. Having been killed before the start of the Italian Grand Prix, there were 4 more races remaining in the 1970 Formula One World Championship, and 4 more opportunities for another driver to snatch the title. Admittedly, that seemed unlikely. After the Austrian Grand Prix just weeks before Jochen Rindt's death, he remained firmly in the lead of the Drivers' Championship with a whopping 45 points to his name. And his next closest challenger was Jack Brabham, who boasted 25 points, followed by Denny Hulme with 20. But it would be Jackie Ickx, winner of the 1970 Austrian race, who would begin to mount a strong late-season challenge. Victory in Austria marked a turning point in Ickx's season, with a difficult Ferrari, and he rocketed 3 positions up the standings with a total of 19 points, tied with Jackie Stewart for 4th overall. By finishing second in Italy, Stewart ascended to 25 points in the championship, and Ickx once again fell back. But when the F1 circus returned to North America for the Canadian Grand Prix, Ickx mastered the Mont-Tremblant circuit to take another victory, netting him 20 points to Rindt's 45. Heading into the next event, the U.S. Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, Ickx once again looked like he was going to be dominant. He was the quickest of all the drivers in Friday practice, and a sudden rainstorm partway through qualifying on Saturday meant no driver was able to unseat him at the top of the charts. If Ickx could hold that lead through to the end of the season, he would chop down the gap to Rindt. And though he would have to count on a win at both the U.S. Grand Prix and the season finale in Mexico to take the title, there was still a shot. It was a shot that slipped away with a broken fuel line. On lap 57 of 108, Ickx darted into the pits for repairs, trading his second place in the running order for 12th. By the end of the race, he'd managed to wind his way up to an impressive 4th place finish, but it wasn't enough. He needed that win at Watkins Glen. Without it, the title was decisively handed to the late Jochen Rindt. In The Uncrowned King by David Tremayne, Ickx is painted as something of an antagonist. While Jackie Ickx firmly denies that he ever had harsh words with Jochen Rindt, many of Rindt's friends believe that he was frustrated with Ickx's pushing back against improved safety standards, and further that much of the Grand Prix field was going to make an active effort to prevent Ickx's title charge should it look like he was going to snatch the crown. In the end, it didn't matter. The Ferrari driver went on to win the season finale in Mexico City, ending the year with 40 points, 5 shy of Jochen Rindt. There's a myth that has built momentum over the years, one that says the fuel line problem in Watkins Glen was a fabrication, or that it was perhaps sabotage. This largely seems to have been strung together thanks to some choice translations from interviews on Belgian television, where X said it would have been very convenient if the fuel line had broken. More than anything, though, I think this myth found footing because Jackie X has repeatedly said that he did not want to win the World Championship. Maybe this is a little creative shading on X's part in hindsight, but over the years he has maintained that he has never cared about championships, and that winning a championship in 1970 would have been a hollow victory. But I don't think that there was any intention to throw the championship. I want to quote X from a 2020 interview he gave to Autosport, where he said, "First of all, honestly, the World Championship had no meaning for me. The goal was always to win races, not to calculate how many points I would get for this position or that. Still, this was a horrible situation. I was obliged to try and win for Ferrari, if not for myself. And if I won the last 3 races, I would be champion by 1 point. I won in Canada, but then had a problem at Watkins Glen and finished 4th. That was a huge release. I didn't want to be champion, beating a man who wasn't there anymore. Where would have been the glory in that? Jochen deserved the championship. If God exists, he made the right decision. I went to the last race in Mexico in good frame of mind, and I won again." At the official awards ceremony at the end of the year, Jochen Rindt's championship trophy was handed to his widowed wife, Nina. From there, she went on to complete his remaining obligations, turning up at the Jochen Rindt Auto Show, where fans asked her for her autograph in the midst of her grief. "I was convinced by the people who were involved in its organization to do it in Jochen's name," she remembered of the event. "It was terrible. I was on tranquilizers. I wasn't coping very well. There were photos of Jochen everywhere and people wanting my autograph. Like I was the star. What had I ever done? I kept asking myself, what do these people want from me? It was absolutely awful, just too much. I completely broke down, but behind closed doors." Years later, she gave up the naming rights to the exhibition, which became known as the Essen Motor Show. Because at that point, Nina Rindt asked, what did the Jochen Rindt bit mean? Jochen Rindt was just 28 years old when he died, and in so many ways his best years were still in front of him. He had a stunning talent behind the wheel, yes, but it's extremely likely that his greatest successes would have been outside of the cockpit. Rindt's closest friend and confidant was none other than Bernie Ecclestone. At the time, Ecclestone was a failed racer who had instead turned to the business side of motorsport, but it wouldn't take long before he became a transformative player in the tides of F1 history. He would go on to buy the Brabham team, to advocate for better terms of competition for British F1 teams via the Formula One Constructors Association, and to ultimately take hold of the sport's commercial rights. When he finally sold those rights in 2017, they were worth a whopping $8 billion. Given that Ecclestone and Rindt were already dreaming up plans to go into business together, it's very easy to imagine the Austrian racer would have become a major player in the ever-changing tides of F1 in just the same way that Ecclestone was. Rindt had an eye for opportunity and wasn't one to shy away from a lucrative deal. But more than that, he was never afraid to make his true feelings known, even if that meant writing op-eds about his boss's dangerous car design habits in major motorsport publications. Imagine his influence on the trajectory of motorsport if Jochen Rindt had lived and brought that same attitude to bear on the running of Formula One. Imagine what the safety crusade of the 70s would have looked like. Imagine the commercial deals he would have organized. Imagine the promotional power of a former world champion who instead dedicated himself to improving the function of the series. Unfortunately, all we can do is imagine, because on September 5th, 1970, one of motorsport's most promising talents lost his life at Monza. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. If you are wondering why there was such a long gap between the previous episode on Mark Donahue and this one, well, I've had a challenging season of life. I've had some illness in the family, and 2 of my cats needed surgery in the past few weeks, so I will still be working on and producing DPTJ, but I'm just trimming down the posting schedule for the rest of this year to 1 episode a month. On a far more positive note, Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys is now an award-winning podcast. The Society of Automotive Historians has chosen this show as the recipient of its 2025 Ingersoll Award. I'm going to talk more about this over on my Substack, but I want to thank everyone on the Ingersoll Committee and at the Society of Automotive Historians because this is a huge honor, and it means so much to me to be recognized in this way. Next time out on DPTJ, we're going to talk about the groundbreaking Lucy O'Reilly shell, an American heiress who used her fortune to carve a path for herself in the European Grand Prix racing scene. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack. If you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, you just want to reach out to say hi, I have an email for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic Turnus Francorchamps that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm going to give a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can find the full list of sources in the episode description. Most of my citations this week come from the same place, The Uncrowned King by David Tremayne. It is a truly phenomenal book that draws together reflections from so many of Rindt's compatriots, as well as ample historical detail, and it's one of those books that I cannot recommend enough. But that's all from me this week. I'll see you next time for another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.